Good morning, my brothers and sisters.
Good morning, Brother John.
What a privilege it is for all of us to be here today as co-students of the Word of God and to look in there. So, my title, as Brother Matt very adeptly explained, is Leading Ladies, Hearing the Voices of the Bible's Powerful Women. And the women of the Bible is not a topic I'd ever looked at in detail before until about 5 years ago when I started. And I guess that was because it was out of a misplaced sense of respect. I kind of felt, well, I'm not a woman. I don't have the right to stand up and try and tell women's stories. That's not my place. I don't have the lens on the world that a woman would have. But then since our community and most communities use preferentially male speakers, well then, if I don't or if we don't present the glories and the achievements of the female disciples of old, then they're going to get transmitted a lot less frequently than they should. And they won't be extolled as the role models they can be for the young women and the young sisters in our community. So with that caveat in place, that I still have the limitations of being male, I will attempt to show you at least the things that I think God allowed me to see when I looked at these women's lives. And I was quite surprised. As I said, I've learned more from doing this study than I have from doing other studies because I just never looked at the material in detail before. Let's jump straight into the material, and we're going to start with Tamar's story, the God of widows. Now, Tamar is the precedental widow in Scripture. That is to say, she's the first one we're ever shown. And God knows how our minds work. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And so whenever you meet the first of anything in the Bible, the first mention of love, for example, it's always going to be an iconic form, the absolute heart of what love is. And who knows what the first mention of love is in the Bible? Correct. Well shouted out, if a bit quietly, yes. It's Genesis 22, isn't it? It's not the love of a man for a woman or a woman for a man. It's God's love. It's a love of a father for his son. When God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and sacrifice him for my will. First mention. Getting drawn away from the material too much already. Tamar's story. Do we know Tamar's story? Judah, the leader of the tribe of Judah, the iconic son of Jacob, has 3 sons. And the first son marries Tamar. But he's a wicked man. So God himself kills that man. And Tamar becomes a widow. As is the Jewish law and as is God's law, the middle brother, Judah has 3 sons, now takes over the marriage. And so Onan marries Tamar. Onan is also a wicked man, and he refuses to give Tamar a son, because if he gives her a son, he'll get less money, according to the way the law works. And so he's a greedy man and a selfish man. So he refuses to provide a child or a son for Tamar, and God is angered by that selfishness, and he kills Onan as well. Judah now realizes, I have 3 sons. 2 of them have been married to Tamar, and they're both dead. So he wrongly concludes, there's something wrong with Tamar. There's something wicked about Tamar. So he tells her a lie. He says, oh yeah, my 3rd son's not quite old enough yet. He admits later that was a lie. So he can't be married just yet, so why don't you just hang on a while before I let you marry him. He has no intention of ever letting Tamar marry again. Now, the problem with that is, with no welfare system, that consigns Tamar to death. She will have no one to support her. Now, Judah could support her himself. He chooses not to. He says, tell you what, why don't you not live in my house anymore either? Because he thinks she's the source of death. Go back to your own father. So she goes back to her own father, whom she's obviously going to outlive. And her own father looks after her, and when he dies, she's going to have nothing. So she is in a state of complete crisis. Er's wickedness prevents Tamar having a son because God killed him. Onan refused to raise a son for the widow who would take care of her, so God kills him. Judah refuses to provide a husband for Tamar and even sends her out of his house. So she is in a crisis situation, and nobody cares. Only God will see her. Many, many years go by, and Tamar realizes, Judah's never going to give me that third son for marriage. I'm never going to have a source of income or food or shelter. I'm going to die. So what do we learn from Genesis 38? We learn that man does not care about widows, that widows is a crisis situation. But God sees all, and God sees the case of the widow. A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling, perceives David. God's character is the one who sees the ones that no one else sees. So he makes it part of his law. When you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the immigrant, the fatherless, and the widow about whom nobody cares. In fact, let's put it the other way around. It's not just that God says, please take care of these people, which humans generally don't. He says, if you don't, you won't be in the kingdom. If you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, then I will let you live in this place, in the land of Israel, the land I gave your forefathers, forever and ever. Well, forever and ever, it's talking about the kingdom. So God is saying, to be in the kingdom, you must take care of those who cannot take care of themselves, which means, obviously, the opposite is also true. That's how important widows are to God, and the care of widows is to God. But Tamar, at the moment, she's still in this crisis situation. And over many years, she plans what she has to do to save herself. And she's going to dress up as a prostitute once Judah is bereaved of his own wife, and see as Judah walks by the road what Judah's willing to do. Tamar put off her widow's garments and put on a veil, that's the traditional garb of a prostitute, wrapped herself up and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She chooses a place, and we're told the name of the place she chooses, Enaim. Why do we need to know that? And why does she choose that? Enaim means twin wells. And the important thing about a well in that culture and at that time, and you can read about it in your Bible, this is where the patriarchs find their wives. Right? We're familiar with that, aren't we? Isaac and Jacob both met their wives at a well. In Isaac's case, in Genesis 24 there, and Jacob's in Genesis 29. We don't need to read about it. So she's sitting down at a place of two wells. And she's bereft. She's a widow. She has no husband. She's been a long time unmarried. I wonder if she's subtly trying to say to Judah, look, you've given me two husbands, and they were both wicked, worthless men. I have to come back to the well a third time, don't I? And here I am, sat here at the well a third time. I've been here for years, and you are the one who by law is supposed to give me the last son to take care of me. So I wonder if, that's hardly proven, but I wonder if it shows that Tamar's a very thoughtful woman. She's planned this very carefully, and she's sat down at this place called Twin Wells. And if that's not convincing of the thoughtfulness of Tamar, the cunning, then this possibly might be. When Judah saw her, he mistook her as a prostitute because she'd covered her face with a veil. And Tamar says, what will you give me for this sexual activity? And Judah says, well, I'll send you a young goat from the flock. So she uses a veil and a goat. She deceives Judah with a goat and a garment. Does that ring any bells? She deceives Judah with a goat and a garment. Who's been deceiving people with a goat and a garment? None other than Judah himself. In fact, chapter breaks are always a mistake in Scripture. It's in the previous set of texts, Genesis 37, that Judah deceives his father Jacob with a goat and a garment. He's trying to convince Jacob that Joseph is dead. Joseph is not dead. He's got hold of Joseph's garment, the coat of many colors, ripped it up a bit, got hold of a kid goat, goat, got its blood, and dips the garment in the blood, and then says, oh, look, your son, this is, is that his coat? It is, isn't it? So Judah has used deception against his father, using a goat and a garment. Poor Jacob, we say. Poor innocent Jacob. Except he isn't. Because Jacob deceived his father with a goat and a garment. Do you remember? He took a goat and he made it into a garment. He and his mother conspired to cover his arms and his neck with the goat skin so that he could deceive his now blind father, Isaac, and steal a blessing that he was never supposed to take that way. So what do we learn? One thing we learn, deception gives birth to deception, which gives birth to deception. It's the family tradition. Jacob deceives his father with a goat and a garment. Judah deceives his father with a goat and a garment. And Tamar says, why do you keep me unmarried? Because you suspect there's something wrong with me. You are no worthy man. You've lived a life of deception. You deceive your own father with a goat and a garment. So Tamar deceives Judah the deceiver, son of Jacob the deceiver, and with the same tools. She knows what she's doing. This is a thoughtful, intelligent woman who is pushed to the brink of crisis and has to save her own life with this style of deception. Not that prostitution is to be lauded, but that was the only resort she had left. What pledge shall I give you? Says Judah. In other words, I don't have a goat with me right now. That's often the case, right? You could go to the store and you're like, no goats. Will you take a card? Right? So he says, what pledge can I give you until I have the means to pay you? Give me your signet with a cord and your staff. Now his signet is literally his signature that he's going to push into wax to show that, yeah, I really said this, I really wrote this. And his staff is his authority. That's not my idea, that's written in the Bible. You can look that up in your own time. So she's taken his legal identity, that which identifies himself, we'd probably use a driver's license or something, and she's taken his authority. In our society, the most authority comes from having money, so something like a credit card. She's basically taken his credit cards and driver's license. She's taken his legal identity and his authority. Why? We know why. She's a thoughtful woman. She's a leading lady. Judah had refused to let Tamar become a wife, which deprived her of any authority in society and any legal identity. She's now just drifting as this human soul that no one will care for and will die. So Tamar takes from Judah what Judah has already taken from her. This is a woman who has thought these things through very carefully. And I'd never seen any of this before I read the story of Tamar in Genesis 38 somewhat more closely. This is quite a powerful intellect that we're dealing with in the case of Tamar. Nonetheless, there has been the sexual activity of prostitution, and Tamar has become pregnant. And so Judah says, sure, bring her out and have her burned to death. If she's been playing the harlot with someone, he doesn't know who, because he doesn't know it was her that he was enjoying prostitution with. Bring her out and have her burned to death. This is the godliness of the man Judah. It's not godly at all. His sentence is both illegal, according to God's law, and completely immoral. He doesn't want any evidence shown. He doesn't want any trial. Let's not waste time with witnesses in a trial. Just burn her to death, which, by the way, God never approved of burning to death. Those criminals who were burned were killed and their bodies were burned, but no one was ever burned to death under God's law. It's a hideous thing to do to another human. And so, at this point, Tamar must act. Her life is due to last no more than one day. And so she acts, and she unmasks the deceiver. She brings forward the signet and the staff, and she says to Judah, please determine whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. And determine the Hebrew word here, I'm not a Hebrew scholar particularly, hakana. is perhaps best translated examine. It says don't just glance at this. Really look at them. Really forensically figure out whose signature this is and whose staff this is. Examine these. And this word is rare. It's only twice in the whole Bible. And the other use is very instructive. It's here, and it's here where Tamar is showing the true evidence of Judah's immorality. And the other use could not be more ironic. It's where Judah is trying to lie to his father when he's holding up the coat of many colors covered in goat's blood and says, Hakana, examine it. Examine this coat of many colors to see if it really is Joseph's robe. So Judah has used this word when showing the fake evidence that he's created of Joseph's death, because Joseph isn't dead. And it's the same word, ironically, that Tamar uses to display the true evidence of Judah's own immorality. A final irony in how Tamar is the righteous one and Judah is in fact the unrighteous one in all of this. Finally, she is more righteous than I. Finally, a confession. It's a little too little and it's a lot too late because Tamar's line is already condemned. But finally, Tamar has saved her life through her cunning and through the quality she has as a leading lady. Righteous Tamar saves herself with cunning, but the damage is already done, and the damage comes from the proclamation of the law. The damage is, no one born of a forbidden marriage, nor any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even unto the 10th generation. So Tamar and all her descendants are banned from the assembly of the Lord for 10 generations. And that's something that neither Judah nor Tamar can undo. In fact, Tamar is finally redeemed. She's finally redeemed, ironically and beautifully, by another leading lady. It is Ruth who will redeem Tamar. And that redemption comes in the closing words of the book of Ruth. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that this morning. As we leave it, Tamar's line is rejected by law for 10 generations for Judah's sin, because Tamar's first son will be Perez, and the 10th generation, the 10th son, as Ruth will tell us, as Ruth kept the line alive through Boaz, will be King David. And what a welcome back into the Lord's assembly that would have been. There's one final detail of Tamar's story, and it's an odd one. We're told about the scarlet cord, and it comes up in the context of a very strange birth. It's actually the birth of twins. I know we have a couple of pairs of twins here with us at Bible School Week this week. It comes with the birth of twins, and it is the birth which resulted from her sleeping with her father-in-law in that deception of prostitution. Here's the verses, and you can see we're given so many details about it. It sounds like a terrible, terrible birth, physically. But we're given all these details, and you think, why do we have all these details if they have no spiritual value? Well, they do have spiritual value. We're about to see what it is. Here are the details themselves. There were twins in Tamar's womb, and when she was in labor, one of the babies put out a hand, and so the midwife took and tied a scarlet cord on his hand, saying, this is the firstborn. But he then draws his arm back in, and in the meantime, his brother comes out, breaks out in front of him. And the midwife says, what a breach you have made for yourself. Therefore his name was called Breakout, or in Hebrew, Peretz. And afterward, his brother came out with the scarlet cord on his wrist, and so his name was called Scarlet, or Zerah in Hebrew. What a curious set of details. So we learn Scarlet was the rightful firstborn in human terms, but God has allowed Breakout to displace Scarlet and birth Messiah, because Christ's line will come through this guy who broke out, kind of the second guy who came out first, if you understand what I'm saying, through Breakout, not through Scarlet. Yeah? Obvious question, why do we need to be told about all that chaos? This is why. it's going to teach us about Rahab and how the nation of Israel was born in their land. Okay, and if you don't believe me, I don't blame you. But that's what we're going to go and transition into right now. And this, of course, should be a clue. The scarlet cord. Now, you've heard that before. We've all heard that before since Sunday school days. Did we notice that there was a scarlet cord in Tamar's life and a scarlet cord in Rahab's? They're connected. No pun intended about connected cords, but they are connected spiritually. So let's waste no further time and slide straight into our second talk, Salvation in Scarlet. A little dip into Rahab's story. I've done Tamar a great disservice. There's so many other good things to see there, but I just want to give you a sample of each of these leading ladies in these shorter talks to ignite your interest, hopefully. Rahab's story is largely set at the beginning of the book of Joshua. As you know, Joshua 2 is the critical chapter. For those of you who like to have a physical Bible open in front of you, that's the chapter to be at. But I'll put all the relevant verses on the screen. At this time, Israel aren't really a defined nation. They've left Egypt and they're wandering around in the wilderness. They're still a wandering, homeless people. And Jericho will be their very first battle in the land. Not their very first battle. They've had a couple against the Amorites en route to the land, but this will be their first battle in the land. And they're standing on the shores of the Jordan, ready to cross over Jordan, enter the promised land, and try and take it by conquest, by the will and assistance and hand of God himself. That must be a very nerve-wracking time. Not just because physical battle is nerve-wracking, and we who sit in our armchairs and read about it probably don't appreciate that enough, but because they know 40 years ago, says the soldier, my dad stood here on the same soil, by the same river, with the same task ahead of him. And they failed. And I'm told, and we're told, it was because they lacked faith, was it? Well, maybe our God isn't strong enough. You have no idea what was going through their minds. I dread to think what would be going through my mind. Was it us who failed? Either way, we didn't get in. We got turned away. Our God was against us. My father had to walk around the wilderness until he dropped dead. So much he was rejected by his God. Here we are. Take two. 40 years later. Are we going to succeed? Incredibly nerve-wracking time. And Joshua sends spies into Jericho. No surprises there, right? Because 40 years before, he was one of those spies that was sent in. So he knows the value of espionage intelligence. How many spies did Joshua send into Jericho? 2, indeed. Maybe there's nothing to it, but I always think, 40 years before, they sent 12 spies, and 10 were hopeless, and 2, Joshua and Caleb, were good. And I kind of wonder if Joshua was thinking about that. He says, let's not send 12 this time. 10 might come back with a bad report. I just need 2. That's what we should have had last time. Maybe that's a coincidence too far, who knows. And so the spies enter Jericho, and they hide out in the house of Rahab the prostitute. Notably, and part of the reason they would have chosen this house, I'm sure, is the fact that Rahab's house was on the city wall. This is an example. This is from Northern Europe, not from the Holy Land. But you can see the kind of drop you've got, the convenience you could escape the city, but also it's not like a 6-foot jump out of the window, drop and roll kind of thing. These are huge drops that you have associated with houses on city walls. And we might raise a disapproving eyebrow and say, excuse me, these 2 men of God decided to hide out in a brothel. Oh, that's nice, that's godly. But I think it's an intelligent choice. They're foreigners in the city, which is rare, so they want to be somewhere where they will arouse the least suspicion. That's probably the right place to be. Rahab herself, we should not condemn for prostitution because she's a Canaanite, and it wasn't even against Canaanite law to do that. It's against the law of God, as it happens. So they hide out in Rahab's house so that the king won't find out. Well, that doesn't work out too well. The king still finds out, and he questions Rahab as to where the spies are. And Rahab hides the spies and deceives the king. And I want you to realize something, that Rahab didn't know the king's soldiers were coming. The first time she knew was when she heard the beating on her door. And she was questioned, where are these men that came to you? She's already ready to give an answer. This is relevant to you, my brothers and sisters. When those hard times come and you're told, or you're asked, or you're challenged, whose side are you on? You won't have time to think. Your time to think is now. Your time to think are the quiet periods you have, the peaceful periods you have in your life, for example, Bible school. That's when you build your conviction. Remember, Jesus went to the wilderness for 40 days and learned, do not throw yourself off a tall height to show off. And he learned that carefully over 40 days. And as he came out of the wilderness, the first thing that happened was he enraged the synagogue and they wanted to throw him off a cliff. And he's like, nope, we don't do that. He was able to react in the moment because he was already prepared. Rahab is able to provide the deception in the moment because she's already chosen. Some while ago, she's already chosen her allegiance to Israel's God. That is the power of preparation. Use the quiet, peaceful times in your life to prepare yourself to know who you are and whose side you're on. Because when that lapel-shaking moment comes that you're challenged, you won't have time to think then. Your reaction will be the character you've already built. We have heard, says Rahab, what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we in Jericho heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. What an incredible statement of faith. Go through the Bible and find anyone who could say, the Lord, the God of Israel, is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. It's not many people who make such a dramatic and powerful statement of faith. And think about what use this is as military intelligence. The Israelites are nervous. They're standing on the brink of the Jericho. Remember, wasn't it some giants 40 years ago that defeated our parents? Are the giants still there? Are we going to get smashed again? And then they hear word from within. No. They're already terrified of you. What a boost. I feel better now. It's tremendous encouragement that Rahab is able to provide. So she has done an invaluable service in terms of military strategy to how the army of Israel can be encouraged. Don't forget, these are real humans. They need this kind of thing. We need this kind of thing. We need encouragement, and Rahab is able to provide it. She assists Israel to be born into their land, and I use that as a slightly intentional pun because I'm going to present her as a midwife. This is my hypothesis, and this is what I'm going to spend the rest of our little time showing you. I suggest to you, Rahab isn't just a woman of faith, and that's a marvelous thing in itself. She's not just some random character that the Israelites met on their way into Israel, just like Alice in Wonderland runs into random characters as she sort of bumbles around in that fantasy zone. God had a role for Rahab, a specific role. She was chosen to be his own midwife, to deliver his people into their land in the metaphor of a childbirth. I've never heard that said before in our community. I certainly wasn't taught that in Sunday school. You may never have heard that suggestion before either. What I'm going to do, my job as a scientist by profession, I'm going to lay out the evidence in front of you, and you're going to decide whether that evidence works or whether it doesn't. Okay? I'm going to show you 4 pieces of evidence. 1, the manner in which she deceived the king. 2, the manner in which she hid the spies amongst the plant life. And then the really big ones, the fact that Israel was circumcised and the scarlet cord. Okay? None of that makes sense in summary. Let's jump into those 4 pieces of evidence. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring forth the men that have come to you." But the woman had taken the 2 men, the 2 spies, and had hidden them away. Rahab hid the spies, resisted the king, and actively deceived the king. Because she said, oh no, they're not here anymore, they left. Just before the city gates closed, they took off. What does that remind us of? With thinking, with Bible echoes, we've seen that before. It was the Hebrew midwives, the midwives. Pharaoh said, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son to which they give birth, you shall kill him. If it's a daughter, she can live. But the midwives feared God. They'd chosen their allegiance and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. The midwives hid the babies, resisted the king, and actively deceived the king, because they told him lies. The king was like, well, why aren't the children being killed? And the midwives lied to him. They said, well, what happens is the Israelite women actually give birth so rapidly, so quickly, they're so vigorous in their childbirth, by the time we come up to do our job, their child's already gone, which is a total lie, but that's what they said, to keep, because they feared God and not man. So in this comparison, Rahab is in the same role as the midwife, okay? Is that enough proof for you? It's not enough proof for me. I'm like, okay, it's a nice comparison, but don't go overboard, all right? It's just a match. So we'll relax on that at the moment. Although I do notice, isn't it nice? It's spelled out King of Egypt. Never, ever in the Bible elsewhere or in secular literature is anyone ever called the King of Egypt, because they've got a special name, Pharaoh, the God King. Why write it out as the King of Egypt? Well, it's a nice match to King of Jericho, isn't it? It helps you make that parallel. King of Egypt, King of Jericho, to match the two. So Rahab is in the midwife role as she delivers, pun very much intended, as she delivers the two spies from death. That's one piece of evidence. Pretty small, not enough to change my mind on anything, but I notice it. Second piece of evidence. Rahab had brought the spies up to the roof, and she hid them among the leaves or the stalks of flax, that linen plant, that she had laid in order on the roof. And the interesting thing is, that word there, as it happens, that verb, well, she's hidden them among foliage, which is notable, and that verb there only occurs in this particular conjugation twice in the Bible, once there and once in the other place. But let me just ping your memories. Where else do you hear about someone being hidden in the plants? Yeah, very good. A number of you said so. When Jochebed could hide Moses no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. Moses, too, was hidden. And that's the other use of that unusual conjugated verb. Only used when Rahab hid and when Jochebed hid Moses. Both of them hidden among the plants. Moses is a little baby whose life is at risk, and the spies are in that role. Now, Jochebed, you might say, well, that's Moses' mother. True. It's also, she was employed as Moses' nurse. The clever ruse using Miriam, and she ended up basically being paid to raise her own child. It's a nice precedent, isn't it? Jochebed became Moses' nurse, so in this comparison, Rahab is in the role of Jochebed. She's in the role of the nurse. That's a very small piece of evidence that puts Rahab in that role. That's also not enough for me to change my mind and see anything or bother to share anything at Bible school. But this next piece of evidence, I think, is enormous. It would be enough for me to believe that Rahab is chosen as a midwife on its own, never mind what we've already seen. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the people of Israel. At that time. At what time? And the answer is, at a crazy time. I speak as a fool to criticize the Word of God, of course. We know God knows all things and does all things at the right time. But in human terms, it's a crazy time. They're about to go into war. The men of Israel are about to put their armor on, literally, and go into battle, literally. And God says, here's a great idea. Let's circumcise all the men now. What a terrible idea. They're going to be weakened, physically debilitated. I mean, you who are wives know how pathetic men are when the slightest bit hurt, right? And they're going to be useless. And yet God says this is the right time. It needs to happen now. Now, according to God's law, when should a male be circumcised? 8th day. The 8th day after their birth. God's law commands circumcision on the 8th day. Leviticus 12, verse 3. Sure, we don't need to turn it up. I'm going to suggest to you, and Brother Tyrone was talking about, God wants you to do things right and according to the right protocol. I have a strong suspicion, I'm sure you'll agree, God respects God's own law. He's naturally going to be resonant with it. So if God says this is the time for circumcision right now, according to protocol, I believe that it's going to be on the 8th day after God considers the nation of Israel was born. When else would he circumcise them? It's going to be the 8th day. You know that. Well, we're told the date. It was the 10th of Abib. There's the verse. So that then we now know is the 8th day after they were born. So all we have to do in the text, starting at Joshua 4:19, is count backwards 7 days, and we'll see an amazing thing. We'll see the day when God himself sees his nation as being born. We will get to glimpse through the lens of the Almighty, if you will, and see God's perspective. Now, just because you want to try and do that doesn't make it easy to do. Trying to count days or measure time in the Bible is usually nearly impossible because, a story stops, another story starts. You've got no idea how much time has passed between them. Worse still, you come across the common phrase in the Bible, sometime later, where sometime could be half an hour or 12 generations, somewhere in between. You've got no chance. But, amazingly, in this early part of Joshua, you can. The days are spelled out, and you can do it. Let's do it. If we count back 7 days from that day, we find the day that God considers Israel was born. Well, the time they were circumcised was the day they crossed over the river, and they were circumcised on the Israel side of Jordan. But before they crossed over, they camped 3 days at the Jordan before the crossing. That's the reference. So those must be days 7 and 6 and 5. We're counting backwards, right? Now, when did they start camping there? They started camping there, they traveled there and camped there when the spies first rejoined them. When the spies left Jericho, they hid in the hills for 3 days, right? Because they thought the king of Jericho's men would be chasing them, and they probably were. So they camped out in the hills and hid in the hills for 3 days to make sure they weren't followed before they knew they could move on. So the 3 days that they're camping in the hills must have been days 4, 3, and 2. Which means the day before they started camping in the hills is Israel's birthday. In God's perspective, not mine, in God's perspective, the nation of Israel was born on the day that Rahab delivered those 2 spies. If that's true, then they were circumcised on the 8th day according to the correct protocol that God had put in place. God sees Israel's birth as the day Rahab delivered the spies. I think that says very strongly on its own. Rahab has a role, a massive role in the birth of the nation of Israel. She was the chosen midwife. That's not enough, brothers and sisters. We have one more piece of evidence. Rahab tied the scarlet cord in the window. Where have we heard that before? That's the slide we saw just 15 minutes ago. Looked like this, didn't it? There were the details of the strange birth, and we saw that Scarlet, the one with the scarlet cord, was the rightful firstborn in human terms, but God allowed the one called Breakout to displace Scarlet, the one with the scarlet cord, and host the line of Messiah. And now we know the spiritual meaning of what this crazy birth of twins was really talking about. It's the authorization of Israel to displace Canaan. God isn't saying, I generically always approve of one race of people invading someone else's land and displacing them. That's not how I work. But in this case, I give authorization. Why? because it's the prophecy of the birth of God's people, Israel. This is how Israel will be born, by displacing the ones with the scarlet cord. My people will be Peretz, and Zerah will be displaced, and I give my authorization to that. So let's see, the story of Tamar and the story of Rahab. The scarlet cord was tied on the firstborn. In Tamar's case, that's the little baby called Zerah. In Rahab's case, that's Canaan's Jericho, Jericho as it was owned by Canaan. The scarlet cord is tied on by the midwife. In Tamar's case, we're not told her name. It's Tamar's midwife. We don't get told her name. And in Rahab's case, who tied the scarlet cord on Canaan's Jericho? Rahab did. Rahab, the midwife. The second son displaces the first, so Peretz displaces Zerah, Israel displaces Canaan, and it's God who chooses the breakout son, that second son, to host the line of his own son. It's Perez, not Zerah, who hosts the line of Christ. It's Israel, not Canaan, who hosts the line of Christ. The scarlet cord is God's exceptional authorization for those who came second, in that case, to displace those whose right it was originally. Rahab is God's chosen midwife. That's the role that she has if we just look at her story according to the scarlet cord. So I think by now, let me just summarize, we have 4 pieces of evidence. The Hebrew midwives resist and deceive the king of Egypt. Rahab resists and deceives the king of Jericho. Jochebed the nurse hides Moses in the plants in the river. Rahab hides the spies in the plants on the roof. The law calls a male to be circumcised 8 days after the midwife delivers him. God called Israel to be circumcised 8 days after Rahab delivered the spies. The final piece of evidence, Tamar's midwife tied the scarlet cord on firstborn Zerah, who was displaced, and Rahab tied the scarlet cord on Canaanite Jericho, who were displaced by God's people. And in each of these cases, or in most of those cases, the midwife plays a savior role to the helpless babies. And that's the way that Israel was seen, certainly the way the spies were seen, as helpless babies. And it was the leading lady, Rahab, who had to guide their future and save their lives. So, this is how I just envisage it. Rahab isn't just a random person. She played an integral role in God translating his people from slaves in Egypt to a nation to serve him. Moses probably was the biggest cog in that wheel, if you like. Even evil Pharaoh played a role under God's direction, unwillingly perhaps. And Joshua, of course, was the final cog who brought the people into the promised land. But in amongst all of that, we can now see Rahab has a specific signature role. The whole thing wouldn't work without her. She was the midwife who enabled that birth to happen. This is our last slide. Who is Rahab? If you'd asked me that a few years ago, I would have said, Rahab is a Canaanite prostitute. That's a true fact. She is. That's a very earthly fact. And I guess if I look through earthly eyes, all I'm going to do is see earthly facts. And I'm going to see Rahab as a Canaanite prostitute, which she is and was. But if you ask me now, who's Rahab to you? Who do you see? What do you see? I'd like to think that maybe I can borrow those heavenly lenses one more time and say, Rahab is God's chosen midwife for his people Israel. And then I realized something particularly profound, that when you answer the question, who is Rahab? You think you're talking about Rahab. What you're really doing is talking about yourself, because you're telling people which eyes you use. Because if I use earthly eyes, I'll see earthly things. But if I use spiritual or heavenly eyes, I'll see heavenly things. When I answer the question, who is Rahab? what I'm really showing people is, who am I?